From Software's latest game, Elden Ring, is winning Game of the Year awards left and right. Critics and players are almost unanimously praising From Software for successfully adapting its Dark Souls design into an open-world setting. And I have to say, it is indeed one of the better open worlds that I've seen. But you know what? I've always kind of considered Dark Souls to be an open-world game, at least in all the ways that really matter. I even brought it up as an example in previous video essays about open worlds. So, as far as I'm concerned, Elden Ring isn't really doing a whole lot that the original Dark Souls wasn't already doing. Elden Ring just does more of it, and it's less subtle in its approach. So, you might ask, why do I consider Dark Souls to be practically an open world? Well, first and foremost, almost all of the world of Dark Souls is seamlessly interconnected. Almost every landmark that you can see in the distance is a place that you can, and probably will at some point in the game, actually go. This is also largely true of FromSoft's other games, including Bloodborne and Sekiro. The first two Dark Souls games, as well as Demon Souls, are also open to a lot of significant sequence breaking, allowing players the option to handle levels out of order, or sometimes to skip entire levels altogether. Where Dark Souls most dramatically diverges from a more traditional open world like Skyrim is that Dark Souls wraps its world in a vertical helix, rather than stretching it out over a flat plane as pretty much every other open world game has ever done. From Firelink Shrine, to the depths of Lost Izalith and Ash Lake, to the heights of Anor Londo and the Duke's Archives, Lordran is an almost completely contiguous vertical space. But despite the narrow confines of the game's levels, there is still a sense of awe and wonder to exploring the depths of a level, only to eventually circle back to someplace familiar and slowly realize that everything in the world just fits into place. It's all functional, and the relative arrangement of game levels helps to tell the story of how Lordran's world worked, and how it eventually collapsed. And now that Elden Ring has come along with a more traditional flat plane of an open world, and it kind of doesn't feel all that much different from Dark Souls, it kind of proves something that I subconsciously knew all along. From Software's particular approach to storytelling has always been perfectly suited to an open world design. It's kind of what they were doing all along. Oh, and before I go on, I want to provide a minor spoiler warning for Elden Ring, as well as pretty much all of From Software's catalog, back to and including Demon Souls. I will be talking about how these games deliver their narratives, which will involve talking a bit about the overall narrative structure and some thematic elements that these games all share in common. I will provide a warning for any explicit story spoilers so that you can skip those. But if you do want to go into any of these games completely fresh, then I recommend you play them first and then come back to this video. Elden Ring's well-deserved success and the praise that it's getting for its open world will likely lead to other companies like Ubisoft, Bethesda, Warner Brothers, or CD Projekt Red to take the wrong lessons and assume that Elden Ring is good because its world is huge, or its combat is difficult, or the UI is minimal, and that there's almost no guidance in where to go or what to do. But this isn't really the case, and these are kind of the wrong lessons that I really hope these other developers don't learn from Elden Ring. Elden Ring's success as an open-world game isn't really derived from robust traversal mechanics, or because it is actively about the journey from a place to place, or even from being almost entirely player-driven exploration, even though some of those do certainly apply to Elden Ring. Rather, Elden Ring's open world is just different from most other open worlds because of the way that it tells its story. It doesn't really work along the same design philosophies as a game like Skyrim or Red Dead Redemption 2 or Death Stranding. Elden Ring's world, to me, is at least as comparable to a game like Outer Wilds than to those other games I just mentioned. Both Elden Ring and Outer Wilds worlds provide a massive mystery box that, in the case of Elden Ring, is used to deliver From Software's iconic method of non-linear storytelling. Elden Ring's non-linear style of exposition is pretty much exactly the same as it was in Demon Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Sekiro before it. which is to say that Elden Ring's story is less about plot and more about lore. Even though those older games aren't technically open worlds, they all embrace the same method of open-ended, non-linear narrative delivery. FromSoft's stories aren't necessarily about exploring the map, but rather they are stories about exploring that map's history, which, by coincidence, you have to do by exploring the map. It gives out pieces of lore, piecemeal, little by little. It's up to the player to put all those pieces together and to construct a history of the game world in your own head, because there isn't a quest giver or a villain who's going to monologue and explain it all to you in a wrap-up cutscene before the final boss fight. Or at least, if there is such a character, then you probably shouldn't trust them, because they're not necessarily being honest or forthright. More importantly, the story being told is multi-layered, and the player's final impression of that story depends largely on how much time and effort the player invested into exploring and also absorbing the world, and on how many layers of lore the player was able to peel back. To put this into context, let's all remember that Dark Souls is a game that hides important story-changing information in the most ridiculously secretive and obscure parts of the game. And story spoilers incoming for Dark Souls, I guess. If you haven't played it, it's been out for 11 years now. So please skip to the timecode on the screen if you want to avoid spoilers. So if you're okay with the spoilers, Dark Souls is the kind of game that will hide a massive secret area behind 2 illusory walls in the back corner of a poisonous swamp that never even needs to be visited or explored in order to clear the main path of progress for the game's campaign. And that's not even the only time that Dark Souls pulls off a trick like that. There's also the secret lore hidden in the painted world of Ariamis. And there are 2 different ways to completely upend the entire supposed plot as you thought you knew it. One way is to attack a friendly NPC and dispel an illusion that you had no reason to believe is an illusion. The second is to return to a boss arena that takes place in a featureless black void after having beaten that boss and completing what you assume to be the only business that you would possibly have there. Like, these aren't the sorts of things that the average player is just going to do on a whim. Dark Souls does not just hide trivial Easter eggs in the fringes of its game space in some desperate attempt to try to reward the player for poking at those seams. No, Dark Souls hides story-defining narrative in those fringes, so as to make exploring the limits of the game world into an almost essential part of consuming the story. That's just the kind of game that Dark Souls is, and every FromSoft game since, and also Demon's Souls before, and I don't know, maybe even going back to Kingsfield and games like that. I haven't played those. Every one of those games has followed suit to some degree or another. For a first-time player coming into these games fresh and blind, you might start to realize that things just aren't making sense or adding up, and that realization might encourage you to start probing at the seams of the game. Or, I don't know, maybe you just assume that the games are stupid and poorly written, and you stop paying attention to the story and lore completely. Anyway, as a veteran of From Software's games going all the way back to the OG Demon's Souls, I go into all of their games just assuming that my starting quest is probably going to turn out to be complete bullshit. And I'm actually going to go a little bit more into detail about that particular aspect of these games in the next video that I have planned.
Don't touch that dial now, we're just getting started.
Other open-world games from other studios are oftentimes too concerned with making sure that the player sees as much of it as possible, presumably in order to justify the expensive purchase price. The actual story of those games is usually aggressively linear, scripted, and very closed, despite marketing the game as an open world. The openness of that world really only exists to facilitate side quests and to pad out the game's playtime and create a false sense of value, in scare quotes, for their product. Those developers will fill the UI with quest logs and objective markers and map markers for collectibles in order to try to extrinsically motivate the player to go and find and do it all. and the stories that they're telling are usually delivered in unmissable linear format, a format that often clashes with the open-ended nature of the gameplay by providing false stakes and also usually some dissonant character choices. From Software, on the other hand, has made a name for itself by eschewing all of that. Its maps may be more constrained and linear than other games, but the stories are always open-ended and up to player interpretation. FromSoft games are infamous for being mysterious and obtuse. Players have to work to discover what is going on in this game's story, almost as much as they have to work to beat the boss. Because of this, FromSoft is able to take advantage of the player's own genuine curiosity about where the answer might be, and whether there even is an answer to begin with. The player, thus, explores the nooks and crannies of the map because of an intrinsic desire to better understand why all of this is even happening to begin with. It creates a feedback loop. The deeper that exploration takes us, the more enticing the mysteries become, and the more we want to explore even deeper. This is also, in my opinion at least, a big reason why FromSoft's DLCs always do pretty well. They always tease at providing answers to big questions, whether they end up doing so or not. And it's also why I think the cut content of From Software's games are always so compelling and alluring. Like, I don't recall any cut content being a popular subject for any video games until the Dark Souls YouTube bards started digging into cut content of FromSoft's games. Now, there's a whole YouTube cottage industry of cut content videos, and also videos about things like taking the camera out of bounds, just to see what else might be lurking out in the parts of the game that players were never intended to see. Here we are at about the midpoint of the video. You might expect to see an ad or shilling of some corporate product sponsor, but not here. My content creation is funded entirely by the generous support of viewers and readers like you through Patreon. Patreon contributions help to offset the maintenance of my blog, the licenses for the software that I use to create content, and the occasional research material. It also means that these videos get to remain ad-free, or at least as ad-free as they can be in a platform that injects ads into videos without the creator's knowledge, consent, or them having monetized the channel, which I have yet to do. If you are not a patron and you are watching this, it means that the next video is probably already available to patrons and will be for several weeks after this video is published. If you are a patron or have been in the past, I want to offer you my sincere thanks for your support. It really does make a difference. I know a lot of my supporters had to suspend their contributions due to financial difficulties from the COVID years. I sincerely hope that 2022 treated you better and that 2023 will continue to be even better yet, and I'd love to have you back if you're able. I know content has been a little on the sparse side lately, especially content along the lines of my old Civilization 6 guides on my blog. The reason for that is because every time I boot up my laptop, this happens.
Hey, no, that's Daddy's toy. No, that's Daddy's toy. No, that's Daddy's toy. No, that's Daddy's toy.
Which is why I've been playing a lot more console games this past year. I'm hoping to get back to doing Civ 6 guides with the new leader packs, and I'd also love to make some content about Humankind and Old World, but unfortunately I can't make any promises about content for any of those games because I just haven't been able to play those games, at least not with the baby right now. Maybe later. In any case, thank you to all of my patrons, past, present, and future. In addition to all the praise for Elden Ring, I'm also seeing some internet pundits saying that all other developers should look to Elden Ring for inspiration on designing future open-world games. But, I don't necessarily think that the lessons of Elden Ring are applicable or adaptable to all other open-world games, franchises, or settings. Elden Ring's open world works so well in part because From Software's particular brand of storytelling is based more around building a mythology than about telling a traditional plot with a beginning, middle, and end. And this storytelling philosophy has worked so well for so many consecutive games, in large part because every Soulsborne game, and also Sekiro and Elden Ring, are kind of basically telling the same story, just with different names for people, places, and things. At the very least, there's a lot of recurring themes in all of these games. Yes, there are still lessons that other developers can and should learn from Elden Ring, like, I don't know, maybe open world games should not be so littered with copy-pasted filler content, and mindless collectibles that are designed to pad out the game's size and length. Maybe open world games should use more of their map space to actually tell their stories. Maybe open world games should embrace a sense of exploration and genuine discovery by letting go of the player's hand and letting them discover the world on their own, instead of being given a laundry list of tasks to do and a mini-map full of markers to visit. Elden Ring's open world in particular benefits from the lack of a mini-map or explicit route mapping, and a lot of other common ease-of-use features in open world games. Players of Elden Ring are actually looking at the game world for paths, landmarks, and points of interest, instead of simply following an objective marker or a path drawn on their map. This forced the developers to have to populate the world with distinct, attention-grabbing landmarks and points of reference. The Erd Tree, for example, constantly orients the player within the world and acts as a sort of progress gauge. The closer you are to the Erd Tree, the closer you are to, presumably, the end of the game. And if you reach the foot of the Erd Tree, and you still have a lot of open questions, it might encourage you to turn back and investigate the parts of the world that you maybe skipped exploring earlier. This all mirrors the way that the lack of fast travel in the first half of Dark Souls forced the designers to tightly interconnect the world in its infamous helical design, full of shortcuts and loops back to previous regions. In both cases, the lack of conventional ease-of-use features forces the player to have to absorb and understand the game world, and also to an extent the story that it is telling, much more intimately. It also trains the player to be much more observant when exploring the world, so that players are more likely to notice interesting bits of environmental storytelling, without the game necessarily having to highlight those details under a virtual spotlight or a marquee. But other games that take place in certain settings, especially settings that are more grounded or realistic, might not be able to create such distinctive, fantastical landmarks, or allow them to remain visible from most parts of the world. If you take away mini-maps, markers, fast travel, or other ease-of-use features, but you have a map full of gray, indistinct post-apocalyptic buildings and copy-pasted villages, or featureless forests, or the samey-looking desert canyons everywhere, it will only make such games frustratingly difficult to navigate. Not every game can have a landmark like the lights of the New Vegas Strip to guide you towards the important parts of the game. And then there's games that rely on their plot-driven narratives. Those are also going to have a lot of trouble trying to adapt some of the philosophies of Elden Ring's narrative design in particular. Those narratives cannot really be delivered in the same non-linear, arcane fashion as a FromSoft game because they are more heavily scripted and mostly linear. Other games may not allow the player to go anywhere and sequence break to the extent of Elden Ring's non-linear, player-driven narrative enables and encourages. Or if they do allow it, it's probably going to come at the cost of losing a lot of that game's narrative cohesion and the dramatic stakes and tension. And besides, this sort of lore-based storytelling is really best suited to fantasy and sci-fi stories because those fantastical settings are the ones that have the most for players to discover. They often operate on completely different rules and have completely different histories than our real world does, so there's just more to learn. A game in a more grounded setting like Assassin's Creed or Far Cry, or even to an extent a game like Fallout, can certainly try to litter its game world with lore, and they oftentimes do, but attempts to do so often fall flat because the lore is just so mundane. It doesn't motivate the player to seek it out. It's either something that you already know from having opened a history book at some point in your primary schooling, or because it's just kind of common knowledge, or in some cases, it's just tedious office memos. It's not impossible to make an open world game with a story that succeeds in the ways that Elden Ring does, and such games do in fact exist. In fact, I already mentioned Outer Wilds, which gives players an entire miniature toy solar system to explore. In addition to the spectacular stellar sights of the Harthian system, Outer Wilds manages to fill almost every nook and cranny of its planets, moons, comets, and star bases with pieces of a massive mystery. The player's ever-growing knowledge about the system's history will be the only upgrade that leads you to the next key discovery or to solving the massive solar system scale puzzle. Hell, Outer Wilds might very well be the best open-world game that I've ever played, or at least the best open-world game at using its open world as a game space and not just as the place between points of interest. Breath of the Wild also has a lot of similarities with Elden Ring, and succeeds in some of the same ways, except that Breath of the Wild is a story more about building Link's power in order to confront Ganon than it really is about revealing the lost history of Hyrule. Both games, at fundamental levels, are about the player getting enough power to confront the final threat, and leaving the player free to accumulate that power in whatever manner or order that you see fit. Both games are perfectly content to essentially let the player create their own story. Fallout New Vegas is probably another slightly older example of a comparable design. It is also less about a specific plot and more about the political philosophies of its setting and factions. The inciting incident of New Vegas isn't really like the first act of a story, it's more of just a springboard to put the player on a path into conflict or cooperation with these various factions. New Vegas utilizes open-ended quest structures, each with multiple viable resolutions and multiple viable playstyles, along with about a half-dozen possible endings, which all synergize well with the open nature of the game map. Similarly, Elden Ring's legacy dungeons, much like New Vegas's individual quests, retain the open-ended design philosophy of the larger map and game. These dungeons include shortcuts and optional paths, and they support multiple viable playstyles. The addition of the jump functionality in Elden Ring takes this design to a higher level, no pun intended, compared to the older FromSoft games, allowing them to create more alternate paths using the verticality of the levels. Paths which may be less obvious and which may require more astute observational skills and some degree of experimentation from the players in order to discover. After I had cleared Stormveil Castle for the first time, I saw videos and wiki posts that were mentioning whole areas and even entire bosses and mini-bosses that I had just completely missed. And of course, there's certainly other examples of games that succeed to some degree or the other at this sort of open-ended narrative delivery. So, feel free to share your own personal favorites examples in the comments. Put simply, Elden Ring's open world works and doesn't become stale because it's doing all the same things that From Software has been successfully doing since the first Dark Souls, just at a bigger scale. It's the same player-centric progression, the same methods of narrative delivery through item descriptions and vague, innuendoous hints from NPCs, the same level design principles even, the same everything, just spread out over a much greater and flatter area. Dark Souls was always an open world game in all the ways that matter. Elden Ring just makes it more obvious. Thanks for watching.